Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is John Euler. This is Journey to Healing. We are doing a deep dive into the issue of boundaries, which is under the overall umbrella of dealing with grief and loss. In order to heal from the past, you have to bring things down in the current, as far as stress and challenges that you're dealing with. As best you can, you have to bring them down to a low ebb so that you can begin to go back and heal from some of the things in your past. One of the greatest challenges that will prevent genuine healing are those people in our lives that we really should be having boundaries with, but we're not, probably because of fear. There are things that are hindering our ability to finally be honest and finally set limits. And we've covered a number of those things in past podcasts. If you would like to access those, please feel free to go to SurvivorSupport.net under podcasts. And I recommend you start almost from the beginning and work your way up to the present, because we've looked at how do you know? How do you know if you have things under the surface? And one of the things we looked at last time is what happens if you stuff enough. And so we used the example from the recent shock test from the USS Gerald Ford. All of a sudden, it just kind of blow up. And people wonder, what in the tarnation just happened? That's because of stuffing stuff. We also used the idea of an earthquake. That you're sitting there, you're sitting at your desk, you're sitting at home, and you feel this tremor. It can take the form of a panic attack. It can take the form of suddenly feeling overwhelmed. It can also take the form of depression. Anxiety is typically adrenaline, almost all the time. So if you are anxious, another way to reframe it, I think in a more productive way, is to not necessarily say you're anxious, but you are filled with adrenaline. And the question is, where does that come from? Because if you have an anxiety disorder, and it's called that, those of us that are in the field, there is a category called anxiety disorders. So there's nothing really wrong with that term. But if I tell you you have an anxiety disorder, then the best you can do is manage that and try to keep yourself calm and try to distance yourself from those things that might make you anxious. But if I tell you you're actually angry, because anger will produce adrenaline, because a part of you is either feeling backed into a corner or losing control or losing your grip, neither of which you should ever experience, or we shouldn't. That is a negative impression, as it were, meaning something is pushing in on us, encroaching upon us in ways that it shouldn't be. So the flip side of hurt, it's almost if a car, is moving into the bumper of another car, and that can happen at various rates of speed, right? So if I take my car and just put it behind your car and I start to allow it to press in, that's hurtful. Okay, so I am negatively impacting you, and the extent to which I hurt you, the extent to which you are hurt is the extent to which you will feel anger. So you will have as much anger as there is hurt. And the last thing you want to tell someone, and churches are notorious for this, is to say that somehow anger is sinful or anger is part of our fallen nature, so at best we just have to ignore it. No, you don't ignore it. Now, does that mean you act upon it in knee-jerk fashion? No. But you'd better investigate it. Why? Well, because there actually could be stuff going on under the surface. Remember? You could have this massive explosion going on. Let's do the explosion again, just because it's sort of, right? We'll boat out there. Oh, what happened? I don't know. It just kind of went crazy. Or maybe imploding. How about if that explosion suddenly went downward? We call that depression. Okay, so a major depressive episode oftentimes is a collapsing in on oneself because of anger. So as I work with folks, I like to try to remind them that all things being equal, they're probably not anxious, though they feel it. And if they're on medication, stay on medication, work with your doctor. Do not try to take yourself off of medication because the doctor is managing your health. Okay, so do not take yourself summarily off of medication. You could actually cause a lot of damage to yourself. But if you can begin to think in terms of that the anxiety is adrenaline that's coming from a part of you that is angry, or that depression is anger pushed downward. If I tell you probably on some level you are angry, now you have something to work with. If I tell you you're depressed, you have to manage that. If I tell you you are anxious, you have to manage that. If I tell you you're angry, now you can investigate it and begin to look at where does that come from? And oftentimes it's coming from an encroachment or a violation of boundaries. Somebody is disrespecting you or has disrespected you. They have taken their responsibility to do what is right, just, and fair, as Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 2 talk about 3,000 years ago. They're taking their knapsack. Okay, their knapsack is filled with we have a knapsack, and we're supposed to just have one. That knapsack symbolizes our responsibility to treat one another properly. To the extent that I do not do that, I am emotionally irresponsible. When I do that, I cross somebody else's boundaries. We have a one-up, one-down relationship going. It's based upon not mutual respect, but now somebody becomes the dumper, the other person becomes the dumpee. They will feel that. That's hurtful. The flip side of hurt is anger. Now we have anger going on, but if I can't feel my anger, if I can't own that, if I've been told anger is wrong, I will feel the physiological effects. That's anxiety. So what am I feeling? I'm feeling the physiological effects of pushing stuff down. So I need to begin to investigate what is going on. And somewhere in one way or another, inevitably what you're going to find is there has been boundary violations. We've looked at in past podcasts. I recommend you go back and look at some of those, especially one entitled, How Big of a Pig? Jesus referenced the word pig for people we shouldn't be dealing with. There's no middle ground with a pig. He said, do not deal with them. Why? Because it's going to be predictable what's going to happen. So unless you think you're smarter than Jesus, right? I wouldn't challenge that. So it's very predictable. If you deal with someone you're not supposed to, that has morphed into a pig, and if you want to find out, have they, one of the podcasts are called the Warthog Assessment. I recommend you take that, so to speak, and you'll find out whether or not you're dealing with a pig. There's also a podcast called How Big of a Pig and What will keep us from seeing pigs. Those are valuable podcasts to go and review to double check who it is you're dealing with. So we have to look at ourselves first, but after we've assessed that we're not a pig, how do we know? Because our conscience will tell us. It'll tell us specific things. And prior to the break, the last podcast, or last half of this podcast, we looked at the difference between guilt and shame. That's vital to understand, because if I'm going to finally set boundaries, I have to know the difference between guilt and shame, because the person that I'm going to set boundaries with, they're going to give pushback. Why? Because they don't want things to change. That's why if you wait for them to make a change, you're going to be waiting till the cows come home, then you'll have pigs and cows. Sorry. You're going to have a barn full. And then you end up being the super duper pooper scooper. We talked about that before. So boundaries are the key to the vast majority of all mental health issues, quite frankly. And that comes down to speaking the truth in love. So to the extent that you cannot be honest is the extent that you're going to have a relationship that becomes hurtful, that becomes toxic, that becomes dysfunctional, that becomes whacked out. And that is not what we're supposed to do, because then you are taking your time, effort, energy, and resources that could be devoted to those that need you and need that and will benefit. You are a steward. And what happens? I'm giving that to those that are emotional black holes. And we covered the issue of narcissists and other kinds of black holes in previous podcasts. I recommend you access those. So, in order to set boundaries, we have to be clear on the issue of guilt versus shame, because that's going to be one of the key methods that a selfish person will use in order to keep you from implementing boundaries. They're going to throw things up at you. They're going to do a smoke screen. They're going to lob little guilt bombs at you. So if you can't distinguish the difference between guilt and shame, you're going to crumble and better not start if you can't finish that process, because they will just become empowered. Okay, so the difference between guilt and shame is essentially this. Guilt is always tied to something specific we've said or done. Our conscience will bring that up. If I can't think of anything, I can ask God to help bring that to mind. That's a prayer He loves to answer. And if something comes to mind, then like in the 12 steps, that's step number 4, I do a searching and fearless moral inventory, and now I'm going to go and make amends to the extent that I can, and the extent to which it's not going to cause future problems. In some cases, by me trying to make contact with someone, it might cause problems. If I've been a selfish pig, then some people actually don't want to hear from me, but there's still possibly things that you can do. As a matter of fact, in the Department of Corrections, when I was on psych staff, the sex offenders were required to write, or part of it, if they ever really wanted to complete their program, was they had to write a letter of apology to their victim. Well, you can imagine how few guys actually are sorry. And so they would give these half-hearted, half-baked, idiotic, insulting, infuriating apologies. So a half apology is not an apology at all. And that's the level we're talking about, not necessarily sex, being on the receiving end of sex offense, but there's a lot of people I deal with that were sexually offended that have been told they just have to forgive, whether or not the perpetrator is ever sorry or not, or ever asked for forgiveness. That is a lie. That's a myth. That is a mistaken notion, because we are not to forgive that which has not been confessed. Why? Because it means the person is not sorry, there is not contrition, and the person will continue. We confess, we accept an apology, so we forgive, and that's different than intimacy, and we'll find that out in a moment. When a person confesses, that's when we have to go through the pain of forgiving them if it's a really significant issue that they did. But Matthew 18, verses 15 to 17 says, if someone confesses, then you forgive them. Then it goes on to talk about the servant that was unforgiving, that had been forgiven. Okay, but the missing piece that most people, unfortunately, that lump on guilt to people that have been injured, is the perpetrator in that case confessed and asked for forgiveness. So if someone truly is sorry and they come to you in brokenness and contrition and humbling themselves, and if you don't forgive, then you have an issue. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you can tell they're genuinely sorry, and that's why it's also a misnomer to say, well, forgiveness sets us free. It doesn't. You want to go through something very difficult, actually experience someone who truly harmed you, truly significantly impacted the course of your life. It's almost easier if they never come back and apologize. Why? Because now you're stuck with, it opens up those wounds. So this little, these little phrases that say, oh, forgiveness, we need to forgive, whether they've, asked for forgiveness, because it sets us free. That's silly. And that's why you'll watch the poor people that are under that kind of teaching. They'll have to keep coming back and have to forgive, because they're trying to do something that's impossible, and not because it's humanly impossible. It's not possible because there's nothing to forgive. And so all that teaching does is lump on the injured party additional guilt. That, you confessed, you forgave, and now it's almost like you took it back. So you really need to learn to forgive. That is inaccurate. Unless the person that was hurtful confessed in brokenness and contrition, there's nothing to forgive. Okay, so we're going to look at then what is genuine forgiveness. First of all, again, forgiveness without confession is simply enabling. Forgiveness without confession turns a blind eye to what God says is a real issue. Okay, again, so there's nothing to forgive if there has not been confession. Okay, and it doesn't make you unforgiving because there's nothing that's been requested of you. If a person hasn't apologized, it's probably because they're not sorry. So forgiveness without confession is neither noble. So if I forgive without the person confessing, it's not noble, it's not spiritual, it's not warranted, it's not wise, and it's not even possible. It only empowers a pig to continue perfecting the art of manipulation, of deception, and facilitates and enables them to continue building greater piggishness. Okay? So I have to be willing to give myself permission to know that I can turn it over to God. If there hasn't been confession, there is no forgiveness. 1 John 1:9 says that. Well, what do I do with my anger then? That's where 46% of the book of Psalms comes in. I would start with Psalm 37. But the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, 46% of the book of Psalms are imprecatory prayers. And that's how much God loves us. As a matter of fact, you will find the coupling of the words, his faithfulness and his loving kindness, are almost always within what's called imprecatory prayers. An imprecatory prayer is an old-fashioned way of saying, Lord, get them on my behalf. We are eligible to pray that if we meet the criteria of Psalm 25. If Psalm 25 matches the prayer of your heart, then you're eligible to pray imprecatory prayers. And you can pray and watch. You can watch that the Lord is going to draw a bead upon that person because he loves you that much. That's how kind and how loving he is, his loving faithfulness, faithful to do what? To fulfill his promise, to vindicate you. That is what has been missing and from helping survivors and helping those that have been significantly hurt. In church, that message has been withheld so many times from those that are negatively impacted. And they've been told, well, just forgive and forget. That is not a biblical concept. Okay, forgiving takes confession first. And then if somebody does confess, I'll know it, there'll be fruits of repentance, then I can work on forgiving that person. Okay. So what kind of boundaries are needed with selfish people? So if somebody has been hurtful and somebody has not confessed, therefore they are not sorry, and they're going to continue. So I shouldn't be around them. Now the question is, once I finally see it, once I don't have to feel guilty for implementing these boundaries, and once I realize that there's nothing to forgive if they haven't confessed, and so they remain under God's judgment, quite frankly, then I can be emboldened to start the process, even though they're going to throw up all sorts of smoke screen, kind of like monkeys in the bush with lions. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those, but a group of monkeys or chimpanzees and a lion is starting to come towards them. Those monkeys, they'll start grabbing dirt and savanna grass, and they'll just start throwing it in the air. And they create this cloud of stuff, almost like a sandstorm. And what does the lion do? The lion looks and he gets thrown off course and he gets all discombobulated, so he will stop. Well, perpetrators and predators and pigs, okay, selfish people are like that. If I start to implement boundaries, they will do all sorts of things to prevent me from implementing boundaries. They're going to throw up a whole maelstrom of all sorts of stuff, but very predictable. First, they'll act shocked like they don't know what you're talking about. They'll act brain dead. Now, again, the best way to honor someone is treat them as capable as they are. If somebody can turn it on and turn it off and also dish out advice, they're eminently capable of figuring out what's right and wrong and what they've done. If in doubt, you mention it and watch how they're going to respond. Somebody who's not sorry will still not be sorry. And an apology that ends with a comma and then justification, rationalization, or a but, that's not an apology. A genuine apology ends with my responsibility, and I put a period after that sentence. So if I go to implement a boundary, The person who has been having it good, meaning it's wonderful to be able to dump, to be able to be mean and nasty. I'm not saying it's right, but in their mind, why do they do it? Because they benefit in one way or the other. And as someone goes downhill in terms of their character, they become sadistic. They enjoy watching people squirm. That's the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, by the way, a white-collar psychopath. A sociopath is all about sales. But when the cost outweighs the benefit, they'll move on or they'll stop. A psychopath is all about causing pain. They are dedicated to having the last word, last say, and last laugh, and making the person squirm, and even if they have to burn it to the ground. So you will find very quickly, and James Fallon and Robert Hare and others think that psychopaths are pretty rare. They're actually not. You want to find out. You draw boundaries in a lot of families, and you'll see, like we watched Mother Gothel and Tangle in a couple of the podcasts in the past, you will see this person morph in front of you. Remember Mother Gothel, when Rapunzel saw the light, so to speak, the stars connected as far as her memories, and she suddenly realized, wait a second, her entire life had been a sham, and she had been used by her mother. Then in her core, she suddenly had rebar, and remember, she comes out of that room, and she looks at Mother Gothel, and Mother Gothel didn't believe it for a moment, but then Mother Gothel figured it out. Rapunzel is setting that stage for, you're done. I mean, we have instant boundaries going on, and Mother Gothel's favorite phrase is very similar, is the psychopath's phrase. Oh, I'm the bad guy. You want me to be the bad guy now. And what happens? We see her pull out the knives, pull out the daggers, whether literal or figurative. You're going to see somebody morph in front of you. That is not a fluke. That is who they've been under the surface, and you will only find that out by speaking the truth and implementing boundaries. And all boundaries do is this. They simply shorten the time frame or the process. Meaning, if you don't implement a boundary, the question is this: how long could you continue as things are? Well, part of the answer is, how long have things been like they've been? Probably most of your life. And so if you allow things to continue, if you continue to operate by excusing and rescuing and not speaking truth and telling them, oh, it's okay, when it's not okay, when they've been hurtful and irresponsible and you haven't brought it up in a polite but firm way, then how long do you think they're going to continue? And the reality is this: as things are now, so things have probably been. I mean, it's kind of status quo. You know, every time you get back around them, even though you do this, okay, this time it'll be different. When I get back together with them, it'll go different this time. Really? How many times have you been saying that? So you psych yourself up to try to be different, but within about 5 minutes, what happens? There go your boundary. I mean, there goes your resolve, right? Because you don't have a boundary. You have emotional resolve without rebar. And then before you know it, because they're such a professional grade manipulator, probably, you end up looking like the emotionally reactive one. Remember the explosions, or you cave in or you do something, and they kind of look at you and they say, yeah, well, isn't it time for your medication? Right? So, and then you explode even more. So what's going on? They've been having a heyday and they're not going to stop. And that's why, as things have been, so they are. And as things are now, so they probably will be into the future, unless what? Unless you begin to make a change. So if you wait for a selfish person to make a change, you're going to be waiting forever. And meanwhile, you're violating what Jesus said about stop it. Do not cast your pearls before swine. If in doubt, go back and watch the podcast on How Big of a Pig, and you'll be able to see it along with the warthog assessment. Okay, so when it comes to boundaries, what kind are needed? Well, it depends upon the context and where you find yourself. They are only as good as your ability to follow through. So 2 points there. So it depends upon where you find yourself. If you're at work and you need to implement boundaries, it's going to be a little bit different. Now, the concept's still the same, but a little bit different than setting boundaries with your own family or people in your life, or setting boundaries at church. Okay? If it has to do with interpersonal relationships, at times it's a little bit easier than on the job, depending upon your situation. Because if you need the job, if you need the income, then you're going to have to make sure, ideally, that you have something else lined up or begin looking for another job. I do not recommend you say, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, and take this job and shove it. That never really works all that well. Better to do it sooner as far as implementing boundaries. And at work, the boundaries are probably going to be, you're going to have to speak to your boss in some fashion. We'll cover that in future programs. How do you do that? But behind the scenes, you're going to have to begin the process of job hunting. But for our purposes, a lot of this, it has to do with at home. So where do you find yourself? You find yourself in a family with a black hole person, somebody that has been sucking the daylights out of you for years and years. What do? You have to make a change, or it's not going to change. And your ability to implement boundaries is only as good as your ability to follow through, which means you're going to have to be willing and go through the process of actually facing potentially the worst case scenario. There's a party that is fearful of that. What is the worst case scenario? That they're going to tell you it's their way or the highway. And it will be that fear that will keep you stuck. But better go it alone than stay in a relationship that is hurtful, because then you are compromising. You are hurting yourself. You're hurting others, especially people dependent upon you, especially, let's say, kids. And Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says this: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, meaning everything you do, everything you say, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. Oftentimes, the root of being unable to implement boundaries is fear. But unless you risk, you're never going to know what's true. And we will continue looking at how you set boundaries and what kind of boundaries need to be set on the next podcast of Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, John Euler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with John, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with John, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.